Do you think what happened to McLaren at the Chinese Grand Prix was just bad luck? Or are we seeing the beginning of a much bigger crisis within the championship team? Because what happened with Oscar Piastri in Shanghai was not simply another abandonment. It was not pilot error. It was not a wrong strategy. It was something much stranger and much more worrying. In a matter of minutes, McLaren went from having two cars ready to race to being completely out of the race before the light even went out. A double disaster that had not been seen in the team since extreme situations in the history of Formula One. But what is really shocking is not only Piastri's abandonment, this is what one of its own engineers later revealed. A truth that is now shaking the team from within, and that could explain why McLaren's project for this new era of Formula One could be in much more danger than anyone imagined. Because if that revelation is true, what happened in China was not an accident. It was the first sign of a much bigger problem. What happened at the Chinese Grand Prix was not simply a strange anecdote within a complicated weekend. It was one of those moments that forces the entire paddock to stop and wonder what's really going on behind the garages. Because McLaren arrived in Shanghai as one of the strongest teams in the championship. They came from seasons in which the technical development had been impeccable, with a competitive car, a very strong driver duo, and a structure that seemed to have learned from all the mistakes of the past. Everything indicated that the Woking team was ready to continue dominating this new stage of Formula One. But in a matter of minutes, that image of absolute control collapsed so abruptly that no one within the paddock could ignore it. The problem started before the cars even lined up on the grid. During preparations to leave the garage, the team detected an electrical fault in Lando Norris' car. At that moment, it still didn't seem like something catastrophic. Electrical problems in Formula One can appear for multiple reasons. Faulty sensors, energy recovery systems, software, or even connections that fail under certain conditions. The team tried to react quickly, evaluating which components could be changed without compromising the car's output. But the time frame was minimal and the risk too great. Eventually, the team ran out of options and Norris' car couldn't even complete the pre-race procedure. A hard blow, yes, but one that could still be interpreted as an isolated incident. The real shock came with the second car. Oscar Piastri had managed to get his McLaren to the grid. Everything indicated that at least one of the cars could compete and save the weekend for the team. However, while the mechanics were carrying out the final checks and the engineers were analyzing the data on the monitors, a second electrical fault appeared. And this time the problem was even more serious. The car's system detected a critical anomaly that required the car to be removed immediately. There was no room for quick repairs or improvised solutions. In a matter of seconds, the team made the most painful decision possible. Also withdraw Piastri's car before the start. Thus, McLaren went from being prepared to fight for important points to starring in a completely surreal scenario. Two cars out of the race before even starting. The image was devastating. Engineers looking at the screens without understanding what had happened. Mechanics removing the car from the grill. And inside the garage, a silence that said much more than any official explanation. Because when two cars fail on the same day in the same system, the inevitable question immediately appears. Is this a coincidence? Or is there something else behind it? From the outside, many began to suspect that the problem was related to the new generation of hybrid power units that Formula One introduced in this technical era. These engines are not simple propellers. They are extremely complex systems where electronics, energy management, and software play as important a role as the combustion engine itself. Each team receives the power unit from the manufacturer, in this case Mercedes, but must integrate it into its own chassis, its electronic architecture, and its control software. And precisely in this integration is where the most difficult problems to detect can appear. McLaren's own entourage had left some clues weeks before. Some comments within the paddock suggested that the team was still learning to interpret the full behavior of the new hybrid system. Even Lando Norris had hinted that the team was not yet exploiting the power unit to the same level as Mercedes, despite using the same engine. That does not necessarily mean that there is a serious failure, but it does mean that there is a technical adaptation phase that can hide unexpected weaknesses. And what happened in China seems to have brought to light one of those weaknesses in the most brutal way possible. The detail that most worries engineers is not that both cars failed. The really disturbing thing is that the failures were not exactly the same. Norris' problem appeared at one stage of the procedure, while Piastri's problem arose at a different point in the electrical system when the car was already on the grid. This means that we are not facing a single defective part that affected the two cars, but rather something more complex within the architecture of the car. When separate failures occur within the same system on the same day, engineers know they are probably dealing with a much deeper integration or data interpretation problem. And this is where the story starts to get even more disturbing. Because after the race, comments began to circulate within the paddock that completely changed the interpretation of the disaster. Some team members admitted that McLaren had immediately launched an investigation with Mercedes to understand what had really happened. But at the same time, a revelation emerged that no one expected to hear so early in the season. A revelation that came from Piastri's own side of the garage. According to what was leaked, one of the engineers involved in the analysis of the abandonment would have recognized that the problem might not have suddenly appeared in China, but rather might have been brewing for several weeks within the car's system without the team identifying its real severity. If this suspicion is confirmed, it would mean that what happened in Shanghai was not a simple one-off failure, but the consequence of a technical vulnerability that had been hidden within the project for some time. The real earthquake within McLaren began after the cars were removed from the grid. While the race was taking place in Shanghai, another completely different battle was already taking place inside the British team's garage. The battle to understand what the hell had really gone wrong. Because for a Formula One team, abandoning before the start is not simply a sporting disappointment. It is a technical alarm signal that requires you to review absolutely everything. And the first thing that caught the engineer's attention was something that, on the surface, seemed like a minor detail, but that actually changed everything. Both cars had suffered electrical failures, yes, but they hadn't failed in exactly the same way. Lando Norris' car showed the problem during the pre-grid procedure, when the team was preparing to start from the garage. On the other hand, Oscar Piastri's car completed that procedure without apparent complications and only reported the fault once it was already lined up on the grid. This time difference in the appearance of the failures was the first indication that the problem was not in a specific part that had broken in both cars at the same time. It was something more complex. Something that was probably hidden in the way the car managed its entire electrical system. In modern Formula One, the car's electrical system is practically a central brain that connects all the elements of the car. The hybrid power unit, the energy recovery system, the chassis electronics, the battery, and the software that coordinates all that data flow. When one of these elements does not communicate correctly with the rest, unpredictable failures can occur. And that's exactly what some engineers within the team began to suspect. The first hours after abandonment were chaotic. Technicians downloaded telemetry data, compared records between the two cars, and analyzed every electrical parameter that had been recorded over the weekend. The surprising thing is that on Saturday everything had worked relatively normally. The cars had completed the weekend sessions without showing any obvious signs of a critical problem. That meant that the failure had appeared in a very specific phase of the pre-race procedure, or that the system had been accumulating an anomaly for some time that only manifested itself under certain conditions. And it was precisely at that moment when the revelation appeared that began to circulate through the paddock. One of the engineers attached to Piastri's side of the garage dropped an idea that immediately set off alarm bells within the team. According to their preliminary analysis, the problem that had caused the car to be abandoned might not have been a sudden failure. There was a possibility that the electrical system had been showing small irregularities during several previous sessions. Irregularities that had been interpreted as simply normal fluctuations within the car's behavior. In other words, the team could have been seeing signs of the problem without realizing they were dealing with something much more serious. If that was true, then the Shanghai disaster was not an isolated accident. It was the result of a vulnerability that had been hidden for some time within McLaren's technical project. And that possibility generated immediate tension within the team. Because if the problem was related to the integration of the Mercedes power unit within the car's electronic system, then the solution would not be quick. It wouldn't simply be a matter of replacing a part or changing a sensor. It would mean completely overhauling the electrical system architecture, the power management software, and the way the chassis interacts with the power unit. And this is how a weekend that seemed simply unfortunate for McLaren ended up becoming one of the most disturbing stories of the beginning of this new era of Formula One. Because what happened at the Chinese Grand Prix was not just the abandonment of Oscar Piastri or the electrical failure that left Lando Norris out before the race began. It was something much deeper. The moment when a team that seemed to have everything under control discovered that there are still parts of their own car that they don't fully understand. In modern Formula One, where hybrid and electronic systems are as complex as aerodynamics or engine mechanics, a small weakness in integration is enough to trigger a chain of disaster. And that's precisely what McLaren is trying to figure out now. If the error that appeared in Shanghai was really a specific problem, the team will be able to correct it quickly and continue fighting for the championship as one of the favorites. But if the suspicions raised inside the garage are correct, and the problem has been hidden within the car's electrical system for weeks, then McLaren could be facing a much bigger technical challenge than anyone expected at the start of the season. Because if something has become clear after the abandonment of Oscar Piastri, it is that the team still does not have all the answers. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.